815,000 people watched all or part of the show last week, and it's only possible thanks to our sponsor, Critical Cosmetics. My good friend Ravi, about whom more later, brings us this first hour of the mother of all talk shows. Mind you, given the numbers we've racked up, we've put his brand very firmly on the map. And we could do the same for you if you want to sponsor the second hour of the show. Your brand in front of all those eyes, let me count them up. That's 1.7 million eyes in a week. Admittedly, two of them belonging to the same person. Thank you, Ravi. Thank you, Critical Cosmetics. Please visit their website. Let them know you appreciate them bringing us this first hour of the mother of all talk shows. I don't know what Donald Trump is going to announce tomorrow, though he promises in capital letters that it's going to be bigly. I have a feeling, and indeed I heard a little bird tell me, that he's going to announce a running mate which may indeed surprise everyone, and a running mate that can bring new parts to the coalition that I still believe Donald Trump will assemble to win the Republican nomination for the 2024 presidential election. Note to duller readers, that does not mean I'm supporting Donald Trump. It just means I think he's going to be the candidate. And if he's up against Joe Biden, I think he's going to be the president. But more about American politics later. Let me start with British politics. The British government, led by a man I'm told goes by the name of Rashid Sunak. How would I know? I've hardly set eyes on him since he took office. Whoever he is, wherever he is, he ain't at the front line. Or rather, he may be at the wrong front line, because Britain has developed a death wish. An economic death wish, that much is common, I think, right across the political class, but maybe literally a death wish. Let me talk about the perhaps literal death wish first. The Royal Marine Commandos, one of whom, once upon a time, I almost was, attending their induction into the Corps in the Royal Marine Headquarters in Poole in Dorset. They are a fine body of men, and I suppose nowadays also women, though I don't know that for sure. Their commander let the cat out of the bag this week that they have been fighting in the war in Ukraine against the Russian Federation, against the Russian army. Of course, he didn't use the F word. He said that they had been giving support in highly sensitive political and military theatres. The fact that the British are now admitting that they have soldiers on the ground in Ukraine is, of course, almost a year late in being imparted to the public, and perhaps only then by an unfortunate blurt from a military commander who perhaps was not even authorized to tell us. But it means that the British Armed Forces are in the war in Ukraine without Parliament even being informed, let alone its acquiescence or its agreement sought. This is a clear breach of the precedent set by Tony Blair in the Iraq War, and which many people thought, when David Cameron reaffirmed it by putting British involvement in the war in Syria on the floor of the House for a vote, and when he lost that vote, changing course. Many people believed it was now part of Britain's unwritten constitution that our country will not be taken to war without parliamentary approval. But that is clearly now in abeyance. If the commander is right, we are now in a state of war with Russia, with a hypersonically multiply, ballistically, nuclear-armed superpower. One which could extinguish our entire country with a single multi-warhead rocket and leave Britain in nuclear winter, a heap of ash forevermore, killing every living thing on this small island. Not a small thing that, when you think about it, quite a major step for a government to take. We knew, of course, that the British were involved in the destruction of German infrastructure in the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, an act of war, certainly, an act of international terrorism, almost certainly. We knew that the British were involved in the planning of the attack on the civilian Kerch Bridge between the Russian mainland and Crimea. We knew that. We knew that British trainers were undoubtedly involved in training the Ukrainian armed forces, both here in Britain and in Ukraine. We learned this week that British judges are going to give lessons to the Ukrainian judges on how to conduct war crimes trials against Russian POWs. Britain's involvement in the Ukraine is second only to the involvement of the United States. Britain is cruising for a bruising from Russia, and we will be very, very fortunate if we don't get it. We'll be very fortunate if our people and our assets in Ukraine and in Russia remain unscathed as a result of this undeclared, unauthorized, illegal military involvement in somebody else's war. Somebody who's not even a member of the NATO alliance. We'll be lucky if our own country or our assets elsewhere are not subject to Russian retaliation. I know that our defense minister comes from the regiment that mounted the charge of the Light Brigade into the guns, rode the gallant 500 to their deaths. We know that the Royal Marines are highly capable and courageous armed forces. But what if they start coming back in boxers? How are we going to explain a significant number of British military casualties falling in the war in Ukraine that Parliament and the people haven't even been told that we are in? But not only are we in a war with Russia, we are now spoiling simultaneously on two fronts for a war with China. You may not have noticed the significant deterioration in diplomatic relations between Britain and the People's Republic of China this very day. The British have kicked out the Chinese consul in Manchester because of an incident at a protest outside the consulate in which one or more of the protesters made their way over the gate and the wall inside the diplomatic premises that belong to China. It's Chinese territory inside that consulate. But a protester made it in and was manhandled and taken inside to be arrested inside the consulate. The British have kicked out the consul. And China has today gazetted that the British government has failed in its duty under the Vienna Conventions to protect the diplomatic premises and personnel of countries accredited at the Court of St. James, and that further Chinese action on this will have to be expected. And so we're not just in a literal war with Russia. We have now begun what may turn out to be maybe a harbinger of a serious diplomatic rupture with China. That is to say, soon the world's biggest economy when we're literally at war with the planet's richest country, by which I mean the planet with the largest number and amount of natural resources, oil, gas, and all of the other mineral wealth that lies under Russia's soil and waters. That's what you call an economic death wish. Especially when, and it is -8 degrees where I am this evening, your country is literally chattering its teeth with cold and cannot afford to warm its houses. Especially in a country whose economy is on a helter-skelter downwards, and no one knows what the bottom will be like. A country where millions of workers are being forced to take industrial action to demand a wage increase that at least minimizes the wage cut that workers have suffered. Take the railway workers, for example. They're on strike because they will not accept an increase of 4% this year, 4% next year, but only if they agree to shut every ticket office in every station in the land, meaning ghost stations where no one works, and agree to the abolition of train guards, meaning only the train driver will be responsible for not just getting you from A to B, but everything that might happen to you on the train. Because he can't stop the train, get off and investigate if something goes wrong on the train, if somebody is harmed on the train, robbed on the train, taken ill on the train. That's the guard's job. So the railway workers, men and women, if they don't accept this 4%, as they have not, are treated as the enemy within. And because the workers in the railway industry are proving remarkably resilient and remarkably popular with the public, with 65% support amongst the public for their strikes, the onslaught of vicious, vile class hatred to which the railway workers and their leaders are now being subjected has to be experienced to be believed. The Railway Workers Union, the RMT, is hated because it is strong enough and united enough to stand up to the train companies' onslaught of pay cuts. For that is what a 4% wage increase actually represents in a country where inflation is currently running at 12%. But here's something remarkable. Almost all of Britain's train companies are owned by foreigners. Most of them are owned by foreign countries. All of these British train companies are being paid massive British taxpayers' subsidies and making bumper profits, which they send back to foreign countries and foreign governments, and thus the British taxpayer is subsidizing the railways in France. You might have thought that all these flag shaggers, all these Union Jack wavers would be outraged by this, but no. Kelvin Mackenzie, the slime that crawled out of Rupert Murdoch's belly, is turning up the volume on his hatred of railway workers in general and their leader Mick Lynch in particular. Piers Morgan who talks to fewer people than one of the railway workers' picket lines on a daily basis for millions of pounds from the aforementioned Rupert Murdoch, is also on the warpath against the railwaymen's leader, whom he accuses of loving to see himself on TV. Morgan loves himself on TV so much, he's prepared to go on TV and speak to nobody at all, just so he can see himself on a TV screen. Somebody called Richard Madeley, a telly dolly, a man who can barely read off an auto cue, but takes great care in the blow drying of his dyed blonde locks, unleashed a vicious tirade against the railwayman's leader, eventually tell him to jog on. This is on British national television. Tomorrow, the British nurses go on strike. Do you remember them? Do you remember on a Thursday night clapping them? Every Thursday, we clap them on our doorsteps. From Land's End to John O'Groats, the government will not even negotiate with them as they try to mitigate their pay cut, which is what the current wage offer, just like the railway workers, is, of course. The postal workers, your friendly postman or postwoman, who in all weathers, and because we're British, oftentimes in shorts, in sub-zero temperatures, bring your mail to your door every day, say good morning, pass the time of day with you, pat your dog. They're being hammered into the ground also by the same British government that this week announced another £125 million worth of military aid to the Ukraine. This is a death wish, all right. An economic death wish, a diplomatic death wish, and a political death wish. Now, I don't have much time to touch on the other subjects we'll be discussing tonight. But let me just say that Joe Biden, who ran for office as the man who would bring about an end to the war in Yemen, who said that the perpetrators of the war against the poorest country in the Arab world, one of the poorest countries in the entire world, was simply unconscionable and had made its perpetrators pariahs that he was not going to deal with. That Joe Biden is currently whipping in the US Senate against a motion tabled by somebody called Bernie Sanders to force the American government to come to Congress and explain why, after all these pre-election promises, Joe Biden is still up to his neck in the war in Yemen, and the pariahs ain't pariahs anymore. And guess what happened? Joe Biden said he didn't want this motion to go before the US Senate. And so Bernie Sanders, the water boy for an anti-union, pro-imperialist, so-called Democratic Party, pulled the motion off the floor. Bernie Sanders' political career died today, not with a roar, but with a whimper. Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy night on the mother of all talk shows.